The air in Paris is thick, a humid August cocktail of sweat, sewage from the gutters, and the expensive cloying perfumes of the royal court. It clings to the velvet of your doublet. You are a Huguenot nobleman, one of hundreds who have followed your leaders Henry of Navarre and the Admiral de Coligny into the heart of this overwhelmingly Catholic city. You came for a wedding, an event that promises to suture the bleeding wounds of a decade of religious war. The marriage of Henry, your Protestant champion, to Margaret of Valois, the king's sister, is meant to be a symbol of permanent peace. Yet peace does not feel like this. It does not feel like the shuttered windows, the cold stares from the Parisian mob, or the palpable tension that crackles beneath the forced festivities. During the ceremony outside Notre Dame, you watched as the bride, when asked for her consent, remained defiantly silent, her head having to be physically pushed down in a gesture of assent. The symbol of unity was itself an act of coercion. Now, days later, the city remains a tinderbox, and you feel less like an honored guest and more like a hostage smiling through feasts while calculating the distance to the city gates. This sense of pervasive unspoken danger was not a product of paranoid imagination. It was the accumulated residue of years of civil strife. Before we unseal these forgotten records, consider this a moment to register your presence. A like serves as your signature, and a subscription grants you access to all future findings, provided you believe these stories must be unearthed. As we proceed, we invite you to share in the comments who you believe is the most misunderstood figure in history. And now the preamble is over. Let us turn to the primary sources and begin the slow work of reconstruction. To comprehend the events of August 1570, one must first understand the Kingdom of France, not as a fractured entity bleeding from a deep ideological wound. The second half of the 16th century saw the French monarchy under the House of Valois was struggling to maintain its authority over a realm torn apart by religious schism. The Protestant Reformation, which had swept across northern Europe, had taken a unique and potent form in France through the teachings of John Calvin. His followers, known as Huguenots, were a significant minority, numbering perhaps 1/10 of the population, but their influence far outweighed their numbers. They were heavily concentrated within the nobility, the artisan class, and the intellectual elite, creating a powerful network of influence that challenged the traditional Catholic foundations of the French state. This religious divide was not merely theological, it was profoundly political. The French nobility had long been a fractious and powerful class, often viewing the monarchy as a competitor for power rather than an absolute sovereign. The Reformation provided a new banner under which old feudal ambitions could be pursued. Two major factions dominated the political landscape, using faith as both a sincere conviction and a tool for advancement. On one side stood the ultra-minus Catholic faction led by the powerful and ambitious House of Guise. Figures like Francis, Duke of Guise, and later his son Henry I, Duke of Guise, positioned themselves as the champions of Catholic orthodoxy, drawing immense support from the fanatically Catholic populace of Paris and the backing of Philip II's Spain. They viewed any concession to the Huguenots as a betrayal of both God and France. Opposing them was the Huguenot faction led by aristocratic houses such as the Bourbons, most notably Louis, Prince of Condé, and his nephew, the young Henry of Navarre. Their military and strategic leader was the formidable Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a man of immense personal prestige and influence, even with his Catholic king. The Huguenots sought not to overthrow the monarchy, but to secure the right to practice their faith without persecution, a goal that was fundamentally incompatible with the Guise vision for France. Caught between these two powerful blocs was the crown, represented by the Queen Mother Catherine de Medici and her frail, nervous son King Charles IX. Catherine's primary objective was the preservation of the Valois dynasty and the authority of the monarchy. Her policy was one of pragmatic, often ruthless balancing. She would tilt towards one faction to check the power of the other, seeking a middle path that would prevent either side from dominating the throne. This policy led to a brutal, exhausting cycle of conflict and compromise. Between 1560 to 1570, France was ravaged by three distinct civil wars. These were not wars of clean battle lines, but of localized massacres, assassinations, and brutal reprisals. Events like the 1562 massacre of Villacy, where the Duke of Guise's retainers slaughtered unarmed Huguenot worshippers, set a precedent for the savagery that would follow. By 1570, the kingdom was exhausted. The Third War of Religion ended with the Peace of Saint-Germain-Laye. This treaty was a significant, if fragile, victory for the Huguenots. It granted them freedom of conscience throughout France, limited rights of public worship and, crucially, control of a fortified safe-haven cities for a period of 2 years. To the Guise faction and their Parisian supporters, this peace was an unacceptable capitulation to heretics. To Catherine de' Medici, however, it was a necessary respite to stabilize the kingdom. To seal this peace, she conceived of a grand dynastic marriage. Her Catholic daughter Margaret of Valois would marry the Protestant Henry of Navarre. This union, she believed, would bind the leadership of the two factions together and inaugurate an era of lasting reconciliation. It was this hope, this carefully constructed political theatre, that drew thousands of Huguenot nobles to Paris in August 1570, to a city that viewed them not as countrymen, but as a contagion. At the heart of this intricate web of policy, dynastic ambition and religious compromise stood a singular figure, Catherine de' Medici, Queen Mother of France. To understand the political calculus that led to the massacre, one must first dissect the motivations of this formidable matriarch. Catherine de' Medici was above all a survivor and a pragmatist forged in the crucible of Italian Renaissance politics. A daughter of the Florentine Medici banking family, she was viewed for much of her life as a foreign merchant's daughter, in the rarefied, often hostile world of the French court. Widowed in 1559 after the death of her husband, King Henry, she saw 3 of her sons ascend to the throne, all of them physically frail and politically vulnerable. Her life's work was singular, in its focus the preservation of the House of Valois and the security of the French crown for her children. Faith for Catherine was not an ideological absolute, as it was for the Guises or the Huguenots. It was another variable in the complex equation of state power to be managed, balanced, and, if necessary, manipulated. Her primary tool for maintaining Valois authority was the calculated exploitation of factional animosity. For over a decade she had perfected a political C-, saw playing the ultra-Catholic Guises against the powerful Huguenot nobility. When the Guises grew too influential, threatening to turn the monarchy into their puppet, Catherine would pivot, granting concessions to the Huguenots to check their rivals' power. When the Huguenots in turn became too demanding or militarily successful, she would tilt back towards the Catholics, ensuring that no single faction could ever become strong enough to dominate the state. This strategy, while keeping the monarchy intact, was exhausting and perilous. It required constant negotiation, intricate espionage, and the occasional necessary betrayal. It bred an atmosphere of profound distrust at court, where every edict and every gesture was scrutinized for hidden motives. The Peace of Saint-Germain and the subsequent marriage of Margaret and Henry was to be the masterstroke of this balancing act, an attempt to institutionalize the equilibrium she had fought so hard to maintain. The primary instrument of her power was her son, King Charles IX. Ascending to the throne as a child, Charles had grown into a nervous, volatile, and highly impressionable young man. He was perpetually caught between the powerful personalities that surrounded him, the swaggering fanatical Catholic leadership of Henry, Duke of Guise, the austere principled guidance of the Huguenot Admiral Coligny, and above all the constant overwhelming influence of his mother. Catherine had nurtured and controlled Charles his entire life, and his deference to her was the bedrock of her political authority. Into this meticulously balanced equation stepped Gaspard de Coligny. Following the Peace of Saint-Germain in 1570, Coligny was readmitted to the royal court and quickly gained a remarkable degree of influence over the young king. Charles IX, lacking a strong father figure, was captivated by the admiral's military gravitas, his strategic mind, and his vision for a unified France. Coligny proposed a bold new foreign policy that broke entirely with Catherine's cautious pragmatism. He advocated for a national war against France's traditional enemy, Catholic Spain, by intervening on behalf of Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands. To Charles, this was a glorious opportunity to unite Catholic and Huguenot under a single banner, redirecting the country's violent energies outward and asserting French power on the European stage. To Catherine, this plan was a complete catastrophe. It threatened to bankrupt the already depleted royal treasury, provoke a devastating war with the most powerful empire in Europe, and shatter the fragile peace she had painstakingly constructed. More alarmingly, it represented a direct and personal challenge to her own influence. For the first time, her son was listening to another advisor, a man she perceived as a political rival and a religious heretic. The admiral's sway over Charles was not merely political, it was becoming personal. The king was beginning to pull away from his mother's controlled run-in by Coligny's charismatic authority. The wedding designed by Catherine to neutralize the Huguenots by absorbing their leadership into the court structure was now producing a catastrophic side effect. It had given their most powerful leader unprecedented access to the king, threatening to supplant the Queen Mother's own position as the ultimate power behind the throne. This was a development her entire political existence was geared to prevent. The master of the balancing act now found the scales tipping irrevocably against her. The man who was single-handedly dismantling Catherine de Medici's delicate political architecture was Gaspard de Coligny, Admiral of France. He was a figure seemingly carved from a different, harder stone than the Sybaritic nobles of the Valois court. At 50-3, he was a veteran of decades of warfare, his demeanor shaped by profound, austere Calvinist faith. Where the court was defined by intrigue and shifting loyalties, Coligny projected an aura of unwavering principle. He was not a natural courtier. He was direct, often to the point of being blunt, and possessed a moral gravity that both intimidated and impressed the young King Charles IX. This gravity, this sense of unshakable conviction, was the source of his power and the ultimate cause of his demise. He represented a future for France that many, for very different reasons, could not tolerate. Coligny's stature in 1572 was built on a foundation of noble lineage and a distinguished record of service to the crown. He was a scion of the powerful Montmorency clan, one of the great feudal families of France, which placed him in the highest echelons of the aristocracy by birth. His early career was that of a model French patriot. He fought with distinction against the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire, earning acclaim for his military prowess and his administrative skill. His conversion to Protestantism in the 1552s was a gradual intellectual process, not a sudden political calculation. When the wars of religion began, his social standing and military reputation made him a natural leader of the Huguenot cause. After the death of the Prince of Conde at the Battle of Jarnac in 1516, Coligny became the undisputed military and political commander of the Protestant faction, the steady hand guiding their strategy through the darkest days of the conflict. His return to court in 1571 following the Peace of Saint-Germain was a moment of profound significance. He did not return as a pardoned rebel but as a respected statesman. King Charles IX, eager to demonstrate his commitment to the peace, showered Coligny with honors. He was reinstated to his seat on the Royal Council, the central body of government, and was awarded a large financial indemnity for his wartime losses. This was far more than a symbolic gesture. It was a reintegration of Huguenot power into the very heart of the state apparatus. The king, chafing under his mother's dominance and surrounded by the sycophantic Guise faction, found in Coligny a figure of strength and vision. The admiral spoke not of factions but of France. He presented Charles with a grand unifying project to war in the Spanish Netherlands. This strategic proposal was the centerpiece of Coligny's political vision. He argued that France's true enemy was not its own population but the hegemonic power of Habsburg Spain, which encircled the kingdom. By intervening in the Netherlands in support of the Dutch Protestant revolt against Spanish rule, France could strike a blow against its greatest rival. More importantly, it would create a common cause for French Catholics and Huguenots. The armies of France, marching together under the royal banner against a foreign foe, would forge a new national identity, one that transcended the bitter religious divides. For a young king yearning for glory and a chance to establish his own authority, Coligny's plan was intoxicating. It was a path to greatness, a way to heal his kingdom and make his mark on Europe. This growing intimacy between the king and the admiral became the focal point for all the latent hatreds and anxieties at court. For Catherine de Medici, it was a political nightmare, a direct threat to her control over her son and her cautious foreign policy. For the House of Guise, it was an intolerable personal affront. They held Coligny morally responsible for the 1563 assassination of Francis, Duke of Guise, an act for which he had been officially exonerated, but never forgiven in their eyes. To see their nemesis not only at court, but acting as the king's most trusted advisor was a daily humiliation. For the Catholic preachers and the fanatical populace of Paris, Coligny was the arch-minus heretic, the antitrust in their midst, poisoning the soul of their pious king. He became a lightning rod, attracting the accumulated resentment of the Guises, the strategic fears of Catherine, and the religious paranoia of the city. His very presence in the Louvre was a destabilizing force, and his influence over the king was a catalyst that threatened to shatter the fragile peace into 1,000 pieces. Faced with the erosion of her authority and the ascendancy of Admiral Coligny's influence over the King, Catherine de Medici deployed the most powerful tool in the arsenal of Renaissance statecraft, the dynastic marriage. The union of her youngest daughter, Margaret of Valois, to the Protestant King of Navarre Henry Bourbon was conceived as a political masterpiece, a single event designed to solve multiple, interlocking problems that threatened the stability of the realm. On its surface, the marriage was a public declaration of national reconciliation. It was meant to physically and symbolically bind the warring Catholic Valois and Protestant Bourbon houses, transforming the fragile truce of the Peace of Saint-Germain-Germanus into a permanent familial bond. The wedding was scheduled for August 18, 1572 and was to be an extravagant affair, a spectacle of unity intended to dazzle the French people and the courts of Europe. Beneath this veneer of celebration, however, Catherine's objectives were far more complex and pragmatic. The marriage was a strategy of political co-option aiming to enmesh the Huguenot leadership within the patronage and rituals of the royal court. By bringing the provincial, fiercely independent Protestant nobles to Paris, she intended to domesticate them. Once caught in the web of courtly life with its constant jockeying for favor, titles and pensions, their revolutionary zeal would in theory be blunted. Their loyalties would be redirected from their cause to the person of the king. Furthermore, by formally allying her house with the Bourbons, Catherine was sending a powerful message to the ultra-minus Catholic Guise faction. The marriage demonstrated that the Guises did not hold a monopoly on royal favor and that the crown was the ultimate arbiter between the factions, not a client of one. It was a reassertion of her signature balancing act, using the Huguenots to counterbalance the overweening ambition of the Guises. However, arranging a marriage between a Catholic princess and a man the Church considered a heretic was a monumental diplomatic and theological challenge. The most significant obstacle was the need for a papal dispensation of formal approval from Rome to permit the union. Pope Gregory XI, a staunch opponent of Protestantism, was vehemently against the match and refused to grant the necessary permission. He saw the marriage not as a tool for peace, but as a dangerous concession to heresy that would grant legitimacy to the French Protestants. Catherine, undeterred, engaged in a campaign of diplomatic pressure and outright deception. When it became clear the Pope would not yield, the French court proceeded anyway with some evidence, suggesting they forged a papal approval or at the very least allowed the Cardinal of Bourbon to believe that a dispensation was imminent. This foundational act of duplicity meant that in the eyes of devout Catholics the marriage was illegitimate from its inception. The internal opposition was just as fierce. The bride, Margaret of Valois, was notoriously unwilling. She was a sophisticated and intelligent princess who was known to have a romantic attachment to the charismatic Henry, Duke of Guise. The prospect of being married to the less refined Protestant Henry of Navarre was deeply unappealing to her. Her consent was not freely given but was a command from her mother and brother the king to be obeyed for the good of the state. On the other side, the Huguenots were deeply suspicious. Henry of Navarre's mother, the formidable Queen Jeanne d'Albret of Navarre, travelled to Paris to negotiate the terms of the marriage. A devout and shrewd Calvinist, she was wary of the decadent Valois, which she famously described as a corrupting influence. Her sudden death in Paris in June 1570, just weeks before the wedding, was officially attributed to tuberculosis. But the timing was so convenient for the Catholic party that rumors of poison spread instantly among the Huguenots, seeding the atmosphere with paranoia and distrust before the festivities had even begun. Thus, the event intended to heal the nation was built upon a foundation of coercion, deceit, and suspicion. The very ceremony itself was a perfect illustration of this flawed union. Because Henry, as a Protestant, could not enter the sacred space of the Cathedral of Notre Dame to witness the Catholic Mass, the wedding vows were exchanged on a platform erected outside the church doors. After the vows, Henry and the Huguenot nobles withdrew while Margaret and the Catholic court entered the cathedral to hear Mass. The marriage, intended to symbolize unity, had from its very first moments become a public spectacle of the kingdom's profound and perhaps irreconcilable disunion. The compromised ceremony on August 18th acted as a formal seal on a precarious situation. With the marriage vows exchanged, the thousands of Huguenots who had traveled to Paris were no longer merely visitors for a specific event. They became a semi-permanent, highly visible presence in a city that was fundamentally hostile to their existence. The official celebrations were scheduled to last for days, filled with courtly masques, tournaments, and balls. This meant that the Protestant nobility and their substantial retinue, as soldiers, servants, and secretaries, worked watered throughout the city, living in close, unavoidable proximity to the Parisian populace. What was intended as a period of shared festivity rapidly devolved into a city-wide exercise in sustained mutual animosity. The capital of France became a pressure vessel, with the heat of religious hatred steadily increasing the internal strain. The clash was in part cultural. The Huguenot nobility were by and large provincial landowners and military men. Their demeanor was often severe, their dress practical and dark, reflecting their Calvinist austerity. They carried themselves with the pride of a faction that had fought the royal armies to a standstill and had now been invited to the capital to see their leader marry into the royal family. In the crowded streets and taverns, this pride could easily be perceived as arrogance. They were outsiders, speaking with regional accents and used to the customs of the capital, and openly carrying the swords and pistols that were the mark of their class and a reminder of their military power. The Parisians, in turn, were a population conditioned by decades of fervent Catholic propaganda. Paris was a stronghold of the Guise family, and the seat of the Sorbonne, the ultra-minus conservative theological college, that was a bastion of Catholic orthodoxy. The city's pulpits were occupied by radical preachers who regularly delivered inflammatory sermons depicting the Huguenots not as dissenting countrymen, but as demonic agents of heresy, a spiritual plague upon the sacred city. For these citizens, the presence of armed heretics was an abomination, a defilement of their home. The marriage itself was viewed as a sacrilege and the festivities a grotesque insult to God. This religious revulsion was compounded by economic resentment. The lavish wedding and its associated celebrations were funded by heavy taxes levied upon the citizens of Paris, who now had to watch their money being spent to entertain the very people they had been taught to despise. This combustible mix of cultural friction, religious fanaticism, and economic grievance manifested in constant low-level conflict. The streets of Paris in the days following the wedding were rife with tension. Contemporary accounts describe brawls erupting in insults being traded across narrow lanes and armed stand-offs between the retinues of Huguenot and of Huguenot and Catholic lords. Ominous signs were seen everywhere and interpreted according to one's faith. When a hawthorn bush in the cemetery of the Innocents bloomed unnaturally out of season, Catholics saw it as a miracle, a sign of God's approval of the coming purge, while Protestants saw it as a dark portent. The recent sudden death of Jean d'Albret, Henry of Navarre's mother, hung over the Huguenot contingent like a shroud, the persistent, unprovable rumors of poison serving as a constant reminder of the treachery they associated with the Valois court. Despite this palpable hostility from the general population, the Huguenot leadership, particularly Admiral Coligny, maintained a calculatedly fatal sense of security. Their trust was not placed in the people of Paris, whom they knew to be their enemies. It was placed entirely in the solemn sworn protection of the king. They were in Paris at the king's personal invitation. They were his guests, and their safety was guaranteed by his royal honor, a concept considered sacred in the political theology of the age. Coligny and his lieutenants were seasoned military commanders accustomed to assessing threats. They perceived the danger from the Parisian mob as a matter of public order, a policing problem that was the king's responsibility to manage. They failed to comprehend that the true threat was not the simmering hatred in the streets below, but the cold panic calculations taking place in the private chambers of the Louvre above. They had correctly identified the source of the animosity, but fatally misjudged the direction from which the decisive blow would come. The ceremony of August 18th was not merely a wedding, it was a meticulously choreographed piece of political theater, and every detail of its staging revealed the profound, perhaps insurmountable ideological chasm it was intended to bridge. The event was held not within the hallowed interior of the cathedral, of no traditional site for royal marriages, but on a large raised wooden platform erected before its great west doors. This structural compromise was a direct concession to the theological impasse at the heart of the union. As a Huguenot, Henry of Navarre could not in good conscience participate in the Catholic Mass that was the liturgical core of the sacrament of marriage. For him to enter the cathedral and kneel before a Catholic altar would have been an act of apostasy, a betrayal of his followers, and a surrender of the very principles for which they had fought. Conversely, for the Catholic establishment, the notion of a heretic partaking in the sacred rites within the consecrated space of Notre Dame was anathema. This logistical solution, an external public exchange of vows followed by an internal, exclusively Catholic Mass, created a powerful and unsettling visual metaphor for the state of the kingdom. The entire court and the assembled nobility of both factions gathered on the temporary stage exposed to the view of the packed Parisian crowds below. The visual contrast was stark. The Valois court was a riot of color and luxury, resplendent in silks, velvets and jewels, representing the opulent Italianate culture Catherine had fostered. The Huguenot nobility, in contrast, were a sea of sober black and dark, wool, their attire reflecting a Calvinist disdain for worldly ostentation. They stood together yet visibly apart to distinct worlds, forced into a moment of temporary uncomfortable proximity. The central act of the ceremony became a study in coercion. When the officiating prelate, the Cardinal de Bourbon, asked Margaret of Valois for her formal assent to the marriage, she remained silent. Her gaze was fixed, her expression unreadable. The moment stretched a silent public refusal that threatened to bring the entire fragile political enterprise crashing down. According to contemporary accounts, her brother King Charles IX, seeing the impending disaster, walked over to his sister and placed his hand on the back of her head, physically forcing it down into a nod of acquiescence. This gesture, a small act of fraternal force, was witnessed by all. The union that was meant to be a symbol of willing reconciliation was consummated through an act of public coercion. The bride, like the nation she was meant to help heal, was not a willing participant, but an object of state policy, her consent manufactured by royal command. Immediately following this coerced vow, the inherent division of the arrangement was made manifest. As Margaret, now the Queen of Navarre, was escorted into the cathedral by her family to hear the celebratory mass, her new husband Henry, along with Admiral Coligny, the entire Huguenot contingent, were required to turn and withdraw. They were left to wait outside in the Parvis, the public square, while the Catholic rites proceeded without them. This physical separation at the climax of the ceremony was a stunningly literal depiction of their status. They were joined to the royal family but barred from its spiritual sanctum. They were allies of the crown but outsiders to its faith. The cheers of the crowd, carefully orchestrated, could not mask the profound awkwardness of the moment. For the Huguenots, the ceremony was a confirmation of their status as a tolerated but fundamentally separate entity. For the Catholic hardliners in the crowd at court, it was a confirmation of the sacrilegious nature of the event, a marriage that was doctrinally unsound and publicly divisive. The wedding, designed to be the foundation stone of a new era of peace, had instead become a public exhibition of the kingdom's fractured soul. It failed to produce a sense of shared purpose or emotional catharsis. It merely completed a legal and political contract, leaving the underlying tensions and mutual suspicions not only intact but sharpened by the uncomfortable intimacy of the day's events. The ominous overture had been performed. The stage was now set for the tragedy that would follow. For 4 days following the wedding, Paris remained a city of enforced celebration. The lavish ornaments and courtly entertainments proceeded as planned, a glittering spectacle layered thinly over a bedrock of simmering resentment. While the Huguenot gentry participated in these events, their leader, Admiral Coligny, was increasingly preoccupied with matters of state. His influence over King Charles IX appeared to be solidifying, and the Royal Council was consumed with debates over his proposed military intervention in the Spanish Netherlands. The Admiral was pushing his agenda forward with a single-minded determination that continued to alienate the Queen Mother and the ultra-Catholic faction, led by Henry, Duke of Guise. The fragile peace of the wedding was being tested not by brawls in the street but by the high-stakes power struggle within the Louvre. The breaking point arrived on the morning of Friday, August 22nd. That morning, Coligny attended a meeting of the Royal Council. Around 10 o'clock, he left the Louvre Palace to walk the short distance to his residence, the Hôtel de Bidessoy on the Rue des Fosses-Germain. He was accompanied by a small retinue of about a dozen of his followers. As he walked, he was reading a petition that had been handed to him. The street was narrow, and as the group passed a particular house, the sharp crack of an arquebus shot echoed off the stone walls. The shot was fired from behind a curtained latticed window on an upper floor. The assassin was a good marksman, but Coligny's movement as he read the petition saved his life. Instead of striking him in the chest, the bullet tore off the index finger of his right hand and shattered his left elbow. The immediate aftermath was a scene of controlled chaos. Coligny, bleeding but remaining preternaturally calm, pointed to the house from which the shot had come. There he stated that is where it came from. His men, swords drawn, immediately stormed the building. They found the still minus smoking ARQ bus resting on a windowsill, but the assassin, a man later identified as Mo Reverton, and retainer of the Guise family, had already escaped via a waiting horse in a back alley. The house itself was another damning piece of evidence. It belonged to a former tutor of Henry, Duke of Guise. The chain of association was immediate and undeniable for the enraged Huguenots. This was not a random act of violence, it was a Guise miners-sponsored assassination attempt. Coligny was carried to his lodgings, where the celebrated Protestant surgeon Ambert was summoned to attend to his wounds. The news of the attack spread through Paris like a shockwave, instantly vaporizing the thin veneer of festive unity. The city's atmosphere transformed from one of tense coexistence to one of imminent open conflict. Huguenot nobles, armed and furious, converged on Coligny's residence. Their initial distrust of the court now validated in the most brutal way imaginable. They saw the attack not just as an assault on their leader, but as a profound violation of the king's sworn protection. They had come to Paris under a flag of truce and royal honor, and that honor had been desecrated. King Charles' excess reaction was one of seemingly genuine horror and fury. Upon hearing the news, he was reported to have thrown down his tennis racket and exclaimed, "Shall I never have a moment's peace?" Later that day, accompanied by his mother Catherine de' Medici and his brother Henry, Duke of Anjou, the king made a formal visit to Coligny's bedside. The scene was fraught with tension. The room was crowded with grim minus-faced Huguenot lords, their hands resting on their sword hilts. Before this hostile audience, Charles swore a solemn oath to find and punish those responsible, no matter how high minus-ranking they might be. He leaned over the wounded admiral and in a moment of emotional sincerity declared, "My father, the wound is yours, but the grief and the outrage are mine." This royal promise of justice placed Catherine and the Guises in an impossible position. The assassination attempt intended to solve the Coligny problem by eliminating him had failed catastrophically. It had not removed the admiral, but had transformed him into a martyr. It had not pacified the Huguenots, but had galvanized them into a unified vengeful bloc, now armed with a righteous cause. And it had triggered a royal investigation that the Huguenots were demanding, an investigation which, if pursued honestly, would inevitably lead to the Guises and quite possibly to the Queen Mother herself. The single shot fired from a darkened window had failed to kill its target, but it had mortally wounded the fragile piece and set in motion a frantic, panicked series of calculations that would within 40-8 hours plunge the city into a bloodbath. The king's bedside promise of justice intended to placate the Huguenots had the opposite effect. It acted as an accelerant on their collective fury, transforming their outrage into a coherent and increasingly menacing political demand. The area around Admiral Coligny's lodgings on the Rue de Bédis was rapidly converted into an armed Protestant enclave in the heart of Paris. Hundreds of Huguenot gentlemen, their servants, and their guards established a protective cordon, effectively sealing off the street. They patrolled the perimeter with drawn swords and loaded pistols, their grim expressions a clear warning to the hostile city that now surrounded them. This was no longer a group of wedding guests. It was a disciplined battle-hardened military faction occupying a defensive position and preparing for the next phase of a conflict they believed was already underway. Their actions were not confined to this show of force. Throughout the remainder of Friday and into Saturday, August 23rd, a series of Huguenot delegations made their way to the Louvre. Their tone grew progressively harder with each visit. The initial appeals for the king to honor his word soon gave way to specific non-negotiable demands. They formally named Henry, Duke of Guise, as the orchestrator of the assassination attempt and demanded his immediate arrest and trial. Furthermore, they insisted that members of the Guise family be expelled from the royal council and banished from the court until the investigation was complete. This was not a humble petition, it was a political ultimatum. In demanding the removal of the Guises, the Huguenots were not simply seeking justice for a crime, they were attempting to leverage the situation to permanently break the power of their greatest rivals and solidify their own position at the center of the French state. As the hours passed and no arrests were made, the rhetoric of the Huguenot leaders became openly inflammatory. Men like the Vidamede, each reason Coligny's own son Lord Charles de Telige, NY warned the king and his council that their patience was finite. If the official justice system of the monarchy proved unwilling, or unable to act, they declared, then they would enact their own justice. The threat was unambiguous: they would raise their own forces, hunt down the Duke of Guise and execute him themselves. This vow of private vengeance was a direct challenge to the fundamental authority of the king, who in the political theory of the era held the sole monopoly on high justice. The Huguenots were effectively stating that if the crown failed them, they would revert to the logic of civil war. Rumors, both true and exaggerated, flew through the halls of the Louvre that fall. Thorough Huguenot troops were camped just outside Paris, ready to march on the city at a moment's notice that the Protestant commanders were drawing up lists of Guy's partisans to be targeted in a wave of retaliatory killings. From the perspective of Catherine de' Medici and her closest advisors, the situation had spiraled into a full-blown crisis of state security. The Huguenots' demands, which may have seemed reasonable to an impartial observer, were interpreted within the paranoid confines of the court as proof of a premeditated conspiracy. In their view, the Protestants were using the failed assassination as a pretext to achieve by force what they could not achieve through politics: the complete domination of the government and the king. The gathering of armed men around Coligny's residence was not seen as a defensive measure, but as the marshalling of a rebel army inside the capital. The demands for the Guises' arrest were not seen as a call for justice, but as the opening move of a coup d'etat, or that would make Charles IX a Huguenot puppet. The king himself was caught in an impossible bind. His emotional promise to Coligny had trapped him. To fulfill it meant alienating the powerful Guise faction and the entire Catholic population of Paris, risking a city-wide uprising that his royal guards would be powerless to contain. To break his promise meant confirming the Huguenots' worst fears of royal treachery and almost certainly triggering the Fourth War of Religion they were now openly threatening. Charles was psychologically ill-equipped for such pressure. He vacillated, torn between his admiration for Coligny and his deep-seated fear of chaos. It was in this atmosphere of extreme fear, mounting pressure, and perceived rebellion that the narrative at court began to shift. The question was no longer how to deliver justice for the attack on the admiral, but how to neutralize the existential threat the entire Huguenot leadership now seemed to pose to the Valois monarchy itself. As Saturday, August 23rd drew to a close, the public facade of the royal court was dismantled. The formal audiences ceased, the feasting halls fell silent, and an atmosphere of extreme urgency descended upon the Louvre. The decision that would irrevocably alter the course of French history was not made in the Grand Royal Council chamber, but in a series of frantic clandestine meetings held in the private apartments of the Queen Mother at the Tuileries Palace. The circle of advisors was tightly restricted, limited to those whose loyalty to Catherine and the Valois dynasty was absolute, and whose antipathy towards the Huguenot faction was well-established. Present were the King Charles IX, Catherine de' Medici herself, the king's ambitious younger brother Henry, Duke of Anjou, and a select group from the so-called Inner Council. This included the Italian-born Chancellor René de Beauharnais, the seasoned military commander Marshal d'Etoffe, and Louis de Gonzague, Duke of Nevers, and another of Catherine's Italian confidants, Albert de Gondi, Baron de Retz. No one with even the slightest sympathy for Admiral Coligny or the policy of reconciliation was admitted. The discussion was not a debate, it was a war council. The case presented to the volatile king was not framed as a matter of religious doctrine, but as one of imminent state security. Catherine and her allies meticulously constructed a narrative of a vast Huguenot conspiracy. They presented the armed Protestant nobles gathered around Coligny's lodgings, not as a protective detail, but as the vanguard of a rebel army poised to seize control of the capital. The Huguenot leaders' demands for the arrest of the Guises were reinterpreted as a direct challenge to royal authority, the first step in a plot to overthrow the Valois monarchy. Every threat of private vengeance was amplified and presented to Charles as proof that the Huguenots were planning to assassinate not only the Duke of Guise but the entire royal family, the king, his brothers, and their mother. The historical record filtered through the memoirs of participants like Marshal d'Etoffe and Margaret of Valois suggests that Catherine argued that the crown was now faced with a stark binary choice: to strike first or to be struck down. Civil war was no longer a threat, it was, she insisted, a certainty. The only remaining question was whether it would begin with a Huguenot coup or a royal preemptive action. The consensus that rapidly formed within this cabal was that a swift surgical decapitation of the Huguenot leadership was the only rational course of action. The plan was in its initial conception to be a targeted political assassination on a large scale. The primary target was, of course, Admiral Coligny. His death would remove the charismatic head of the faction and the source of the king's corruption. Alongside him, a list was drawn up of his principal lieutenants and the most influential Huguenot nobles currently in Paris, like François Hickfrodet and Charles d'Igny. The objective was to eliminate the entire command structure of the Protestant military and political apparatus in a single coordinated blow. By removing the generals, they reasoned the army would scatter. The two young Protestant princes Henry of Navarre and the Prince of Conde were to be spared due to their royal blood, but they were to be captured and forced to convert to Catholicism, thus neutralizing them as figureheads. The primary obstacle to this plan was the king himself. Charles IX was trapped in a state of psychological agony. He had personally guaranteed the admiral's safety. He had wept at his bedside and sworn a sacred oath of justice. The proposal to murder the very man he had just vowed to protect represented a profound personal and political betrayal. For hours he resisted the immense pressure from his mother, his brother, and his counselors. He reportedly paced the chamber argued and wept, horrified by the bloody path being laid before him. It was only after a sustained psychological assault that his resolve finally shattered. According to the memoirs of the Duke of Anjou, Catherine, seeing his vacillation, employed her final most potent argument. She accused him of cowardice, of siding with his family's enemies against his own blood, and threatened that she and Anjou would leave the court and abandon him to his fate. This threat of maternal abandonment, combined with the relentless warnings of conspiracy and the sheer exhaustion of the ordeal, finally broke him. In a sudden violent paroxysm of rage and panic, Charles IX reportedly let complete reversal, gave his consent in the most extreme terms possible. By God's death, he is said to have shouted, since you want to kill the admiral, then kill him. But you must also kill all the Huguenots in France, so that not one is left to reproach me later. Kill them all. With that furious fatalistic outburst, the king gave his royal sanction. The limited plan for a targeted assassination was instantly transformed by the king's own desperate words into a potential warrant for a general massacre. The floodgates of violence had been opened by the very monarch who was sworn to protect all his subjects. The king's furious capitulation hung in the air of the chamber, a final irrevocable act of state. The hours of intense psychological pressure had culminated in a royal command born not of strategic calculation, but of emotional exhaustion and panicked rage. For Catherine de' Medici and the assembled war council, this outburst was the critical authorization they required. The king's personal torment was in that moment irrelevant, his words spoken, as the sovereign of France carried the weight of law. The ambiguity of his consent, whether it was a reluctant approval for a targeted strike or a genuine call for a widespread purge, was a matter for later debate. In the immediate aftermath, those who sought violence were given the only thing they needed: the veneer of royal legitimacy. The point of no return had been crossed. The frenetic energy of conspiracy now shifted into the cold, methodical logistics of murder. The historical record concerning Charles IX's precise roving mental state at this pivotal moment is forever clouded, filtered primarily through the self-serving memoirs of the key participants. His brother, the future King Henry II, depicted Charles as weak and vacillating, a man who had to be goaded into action to save the kingdom, a narrative that conveniently elevated his own role as a decisive figure. His sister Margaret of Valois, 18 years later, sought to distance both herself and her new husband Henry of Navarre from the bloody events, portraying Charles as a tragic figure trapped by the machinations of his mother and counselors. What emerges from these conflicting accounts is not a monstrous tyrant, but a deeply unstable young man, psychologically broken by the competing loyalties to his mother, his friend, the admiral, and his own sovereign duty. He was a king in name, but a pawn in a game whose rules were dictated by more ruthless players. The central debate among historians revolves around the intended scope of the violence that Charles authorized. The initial plan formulated by Catherine's inner circle appears to have been a surgical strike, the elimination of Admiral Coligny and approximately 50 of his principal captains and nobles. This was conceived as a pre-mine attempted decapitation of the Huguenot military leadership, a classic piece of Renaissance statecraft designed to neutralize a perceived threat and plunge the rival faction into chaos. It was a political act, albeit a brutal one, consistent with the ruthless pragmatism Catherine had displayed throughout her career. However, the king's desperate cry to kill them all provided a much broader mandate. For men like Henry, Duke of Guise, who was driven by a deep-seated personal vendetta, and for the fanatical Catholic authorities of Paris, the king's words were interpreted in their most literal and expansive sense. They saw not a limited security operation but a royal license to purify the city of heresy. Whether Charles truly meant what he said in his fit of rage or whether it was simply a cry of despair is ultimately unknowable. What is certain is that his words were seized upon by those who had long desired a general massacre, providing them with the crucial justification they needed to unleash forces far beyond the control of the Louvre. The king's consent, however contested and reluctant, was the key that unlocked the gates of a long simmering popular hatred. With the decision made, the responsibility for its execution was delegated. The Duke of Guise was personally tasked with overseeing the assassination of his arch-nemesis Admiral Coligny. This was not merely a strategic assignment, it was the granting of a private vendetta under the color of state security. Guise, along with the Duke of Anjou, was given command of the royal guards to enforce the initial stages of the operation. To expand the plan from a targeted killing to a city-wide action, the conspirators needed the cooperation of the Parisian municipal government. The provost of the merchants, the head of the city's civil administration, and the captains of the civic militia were summoned to the Louvre late that night. They were informed of a supposed Huguenot plot to overthrow the king and were given royal orders to arm their men, secure the city gates to prevent any Huguenots from escaping, and to take control of the key strategic points such as the river crossings. They were also instructed to have their men distinguish themselves with a white cross on their hats and a white armband, symbols of Catholic purity. The stage was being methodically set, transforming a royal palace conspiracy into a city-wide military operation, all under the cloak of darkness and the seal of a tortured king's command. With the king's fatal consent secured, the machinery of the conspiracy moved with swift and silent precision through the final hours of darkness. The city of Paris, exhausted from a week of feasting and tension, fell into a shallow, uneasy slumber. The narrow unlit streets were empty, but they were not calm. In the shadows men were moving. Messengers on horseback galloped out of the city, with sealed orders for provincial governors. Within the city walls, the captains of the civic militia roused their most trusted men, passing on the royal command in hushed, urgent tones. The official narrative was simple and effective. The Huguenots, using the attempted assassination of their admiral as a pretext, were on the verge of launching a coup to kill the royal family and seize the state. The action about to be taken was not murder, they were told, but a necessary act of self-preservation for the king and the kingdom. The conspirators were not merely neutralizing a political threat, they were preempting a rebellion. The tactical plan for initiating the operation was centered on a single, unambiguous signal. At a predetermined hour, the great bell of the church of Saint Mainister, was to be rung. This was not a random choice. The church stood adjacent to the Louvre Palace, effectively serving as the parish church of the monarchy. Its bell was the one the king himself would hear most clearly. Ringing it was a symbolic act, an acoustic projection of royal authority. The sound would carry across the nearby neighborhoods, where most of the prominent Huguenot leaders were lodged. The specific peal to be used was the torrent, rapid ringing reserved for extreme emergencies, like a fire or an attack on the city. It was a sound designed to evoke immediate fear and a call to arms. The appointed time was set for some time before dawn on Sunday, August 24th, the feast day of the Apostle Street. Bartholomew. There was, however, a critical flaw in the plan's timing. The signal was set prematurely. Accounts differ on the exact cause, but most point to the extreme anxiety of the conspirators at the Louvre. Fearing a leak or perhaps losing their nerve, they decided to advance the schedule. Sometime around 1:30 or 2 in the morning hours before the planned pre-dawn strike, the signal was given. The deep resonant tones of the tocsin began to toll from the bell tower of Saint Mainister. Is a sudden violent clang or that ripped through the nocturnal silence. This premature signal had immediate and catastrophic consequences. First, it plunged the initial stages of the operation into confusion. Second, and more fatally, it ensured that many of the Huguenots would be awake, not ambushed in their sleep, leading to pockets of fierce, desperate resistance. The sound of the bell was the trigger for several coordinated actions. The first and most important was the assault on Admiral Coligny's residence, which was to be personally led by Henry, Duke of Guise. He, along with other Catholic nobles like the Duke of Aumale and the king's bastard half-brother, the Chevalier d'Angoulême, had gathered a company of soldiers and retainers near by waiting in the darkness for the signal. For Gaius, this was the culmination of a decade of hatred. The moment he would finally avenge his father's death. Simultaneously, the guards at the Louvre, under direct orders from the king and the Duke of Anjou, began their own work. The palace, which should have been a sanctuary, was transformed into a trap. The Huguenot nobles who had been given lodgings within its walls, including some of the most prominent figures of the faction like Lorohic Faudet, were to be systematically hunted down. The gates of the palace were sealed. The Swiss guards and the king's archers were given their list. The guests who had supped with the king only hours before were now marked for death. Across the city, the tocsin from Saint-Germain-Celle-au-Arrois was answered by the bells of other parish churches. This spreading wave of sound acted as the general alarm for the civic militia and the Catholic populace. Men poured into the streets, many already armed with swords, pikes, and butchers' knives. The pre-miners distributed insignia, the white cross chalked onto a cap, the white scarf tied around an arm began to appear, a grim uniform for the impromptu army of killers. The chaos was no longer contained within the Louvre strategic planning sessions. It had been unleashed upon the city itself, powered by the terrifying legitimizing sound of the church bells. The night was no longer just dark, it was filled with the promise of imminent sanctified violence. The first objective, the linchpin of the entire operation, was the elimination of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. His death was intended to be a swift symbolic act that would demoralize the Huguenot faction and signal the beginning of the broader purge. The responsibility for this pivotal act fell to Henry, Duke of Guise, who approached the task with the grim satisfaction of a man fulfilling a long-delayed blood feud. As the tocsin from Saint-Germain-Celle-au-Arrois began to peel, Guise, accompanied by the Duke of Aumale and a detachment of soldiers, arrived outside the Admiral's lodgings on the Rue de Bitheswai. He remained on horseback in the courtyard below, choosing to command the scene, rather than participate directly in the killing. The act itself was delegated to a small hand-picked team of his retainers. Inside the house, the atmosphere was one of weary vigilance. Coligny, his arm in a sling and his hand bandaged from the assassination attempt 2 days prior, was awake. He was attended by his surgeon Ambroise Père and his Protestant chaplain Merlin. A small contingent of his own guard, supplemented by a few royal soldiers under the command of a man named Corsines, nominally assigned by the king for his protection, stood watch. The sudden violent ringing of the church bell, followed immediately by the sound of hammering on the outer gate, signaled that the crisis had arrived. The royal guard under Corsines offered no resistance. In an act of immediate betrayal, they either stood aside or actively helped the Duke of Guise's men break down the gate. As the attackers stormed into the courtyard, the Admiral's small force of Swiss guards made a desperate but futile stand on the main staircase. They were quickly overwhelmed and cut down. Hearing the clash of steel and the shouts from below, Coligny understood precisely what was happening. Accounts from the survivors who were present in the room, such as his chaplain, state that he remained perfectly composed. He reportedly told his companions, "I have long been prepared for death." He spent his final moments in prayer. The killing party, led by a mercenary known as Charles Donowitz or Jean D. BSM, burst into the bedchamber. They found the Admiral standing, weakened but defiant. According to the most widely accepted account, BSM stepped forward and demanded, "Are you the Admiral?" Coligny looked at the younger man and replied with simple dignity, "I am. But you, young man, should respect my grey hairs and my infirmity." His words had no effect. The SME uttered an oath and plunged his sword deep into Coligny's chest. The other men in the room then fell upon him, stabbing his body repeatedly with their daggers. From the courtyard below, the Duke of Guise grew impatient. He shouted up, demanding to know if the deed was done. When BSME confirmed that Coligny was dead, Guise commanded him to throw the body from the window, so that he could see it for himself. Coligny's corpse, limp and bleeding, was unceremoniously shoved through the casement and fell with a heavy thud onto the courtyard. Guise, dismounting from his horse, is said to have approached the body. Some accounts claim he wiped the blood from the Admiral's face with his boot to be certain of his identity. Satisfied, he looked at his followers and declared, "We have started well. Let us now go on to the others, for the king commands it." The mutilation of Coligny's body began almost immediately, an act of symbolic desecration that set the tone for the popular savagery that would follow. The crowd that had gathered outside, drawn by the commotion, fell upon the corpse in a frenzy. His head was severed and, according to some reports, was eventually embalmed and sent to the Pope in Rome as a trophy. His hands were cut off. His body was dragged through the spectacle for the cheering mob before being subjected to further indignities and eventually hung by its feet from the public gallows at Montfaucon. The targeted quasi-legal execution ordered by the king had, in its very first act, evolved into a ritual of unrestrained popular brutality. The death of the admiral was not just a political murder, it was an act of extreme symbolic violence intended to annihilate not just the man, but the very idea of Protestant legitimacy in France. While the Duke of Guise was overseeing the execution of Admiral Coligny Parallelend, even more chilling operation was unfolding within the supposedly sacrosanct walls of the Louvre Palace itself. The royal residence, which for weeks had been the stage for forced festivities and tense diplomacy, was systematically converted into an abattoir. The Huguenot nobles who had been granted the honor of lodging in the palace, a gesture intended to signify their security and proximity to the king, found themselves in a meticulously designed trap from which there was no escape. The sealing of the palace gates upon the first tolling of the tocsin was the final step in transforming the royal home into a prison. The signal awakened the Protestant guests to a scene of nightmarish confusion. The sounds of shouting, running feet, and the distant clash of steel echoed through the ornate corridors. Many, roused from sleep, initially believed the commotion to be part of another elaborate and boorish court prank, a common amusement in the Valois court. This assumption proved to be a fatal miscalculation. The killers were not a disorganized mob, they were the king's own Swiss guards and French archers, men whose duty was to protect the palace and its inhabitants. Acting under the direct command of the Duke of Anjou and other Catholic lords, they moved through the halls with ruthless efficiency, working from lists of designated targets. One of the most prominent victims of this internal purge was François d'Ile-Arohic-Faudet, a nobleman of high rank and a personal friend of the king. He had spent the previous evening in jovial company with Charles IX, engaging in games and conversation until late. Awakened by a loud knocking, he opened his chamber door to a group of armed masked men. Believing it to be the king and his companions continuing their revelry, he reportedly laughed and prepared to join in the jest. The response was a volley of dagger thrusts that ended his life on the threshold of his room. A similar fate met Charles d'Ital, IGN Coligny's son in Linus, a respected moderate who had been instrumental in negotiating the peace. He was hunted down on the palace rooftops as he attempted to flee. The killing was not confined to the high-ranking nobles. As the initial targeted assassinations were completed, the violence escalated. Huguenot gentlemen and their servants awakened and, now fully aware of the danger, poured out of their chambers and into the palace courtyards, hoping to rally and mount a defense or find some means of escape. They were met by disciplined ranks of guards who cut them down without mercy. The main courtyard of the Louvre, the scene of so much courtly pageantry, became a killing field. The Swiss guards, renowned for their discipline, formed lines and dispatched the fleeing Protestants with the cold proficiency of a battlefield execution. The two most important Huguenots in the palace, however, were deliberately spared the sword. The new royal brothers Law King Henry of Navarre and his cousin Henry, Prince of Conde, were roused from their beds not by a detachment of the king's guards. They were disarmed and escorted under heavy guard to the king's chambers. There they were presented with the stark choice delivered by a frantic and terrified Charles: attend Catholic Mass or suffer immediate death. Their royal blood saved them from the summary execution meted out to their followers, but their lives were now forfeit to the king's will. Their capture and forced conversion were a crucial part of the plan designed to neutralize the Bourbon line as a source of Protestant leadership. The direct involvement of King Charles IX in the bloodshed remains a subject of intense historical debate. A potent enduring legend popularized by Huguenot pamphleteers after the event holds that the king, in a state of crazed excitement, took an arquebus and fired from a palace window down upon the Protestants struggling to escape across the Seine. While this image of the monarch as an active participant in the slaughter is not substantiated by any reliable contemporary Catholic sources and is likely an exaggeration designed to cast Charles as a monstrous tyrant. What is not in dispute, however, is that the massacre within the Louvre was carried out in his name and by his own guards. Whether he fired or not, the blood of his guests was shed under his roof by his command and with his full authority. The execution of the Huguenot leadership within the Louvre was the controlled internal phase of the operation. The true and irreversible escalation occurred when the violence spilled out of the palace gates and merged with the latent furies of the city of Paris. The catalyst for this transformation was the public actions of the Catholic nobility. After confirming Admiral Coligny's death, the Duke of Guise and his entourage rode out from the courtyard, their swords stained, and began to move through the adjacent streets. To the militia captains and the assembling crowds, Guise's presence was a clear signal. His cry that the killings were commanded by the king was the critical piece of propaganda that removed any ambiguity. It was a royal sanction, a declaration of open season on the Huguenots, proclaimed not by a bureaucrat, but by one of the great princes of the realm. This public performance transformed a palace conspiracy into a popular mandate. What had been in its conception a targeted strike against a specific list of military and political leaders now metastasized. The municipal authorities, summoned to the Louvre hours earlier by Catherine, began to execute their orders with grim efficiency. The provost of the merchants and the city, each Evanes, mobilized the bourgeois militia, the citizen-minus soldiers of Paris' various districts. These were not the urban poor, they were predominantly shopkeepers, artisans, unguild members, the solid, fanatically Catholic middle class of the city. They were the organizational backbone of the popular massacre. Following their instructions, they began marking the doors of known Huguenot residences, with chalk providing a simple, horrifying guide for the killing parties that would follow. They distributed the white crosses to be fixed to caps and the white armbands, creating an instant uniform that separated friend from foe and fostered a powerful anonymous sense of collective identity among the killers. This organized mobilization, however, quickly became the framework upon which a far more chaotic and indiscriminate popular frenzy was built. The tocsin, still ringing from church towers across the city, did more than call the militia to their posts. It awakened the Parisian mob and gave its long simmering hatred a divine and royal license. Decades of inflammatory sermons from the city's pulpits, which had depicted Huguenots as demonic polluters of the body politic, now bore their terrible fruit. For many Parisians, this was not murder, it was a sacred act of purification, a civic exorcism. This religious zeal was inextricably fused with powerful socio-economic motives. The massacre provided a perfect opportunity to settle old scores, eliminate business rivals, and erase personal debts. Creditors were slain by their debtors, artisans murdered their more successful competitors. The homes of wealthy Huguenot merchants and jewelers were marked not just for heresy but for plunder. The violence was not merely ideological, it was deeply opportunistic. The cry for the king and the Catholic faith became a convenient justification for acts of robbery, settling on personal enrichment. The methodology of the slaughter was intimate and brutal. It was not a battle fought in the streets, but a series of simultaneous home invasions. Guided by the militia, groups of armed citizens would hammer on the doors of marked houses. If the inhabitants refused to open, the doors were smashed down with axes and sledgehammers. Once inside, the perpetrators killed everyone they found: noblemen, servants, merchants, women, children, and the elderly. Entire families were systematically annihilated to ensure no one was left to lay claim to their property or to bear witness. The violence was characterized by an extreme and performative cruelty. Bodies were thrown from windows onto the streets below, where they were stripped, mocked, and mutilated by the crowds. The initial calculated political objective of the Louvre conspirators was rapidly submerged in a tidal wave of popular savagery that they had unleashed but could no longer control. The limited surgical strike had become a full-blown city-wide pogrom driven by a momentum all its own. To analyze the events that unfolded on the streets of Paris from August 24th onwards is to conduct a post-mortem on a body politic in the throes of a catastrophic seizure. The violence was not a uniform monolithic act but a complex social phenomenon with its own internal logic, rituals, and symbols. The anatomy of this mass hysteria reveals a lethal fusion of organized direction from above and spontaneous frenzied participation from below. It was a pathology that had been latent in the city for years and which, once triggered, followed a predictable and terrifying course. The constant deafening clangor of the church bells provided the acoustic environment for the slaughter, a ceaseless auditory reminder that the work being done was not only sanctioned by the king but blessed by God. The perpetrators of the violence were a cross-section of Parisian Catholic society. While the initial targeted assassinations were carried out by noble retinues and royal guards, the general massacre was the work of the citizenry. The bourgeois militia, composed of guild masters, merchants, and artisans, provided the organizational structure. They were the ones who knew the neighborhoods, who could identify the Huguenot households, and who possessed a degree of military discipline. They constituted the semi-minus official agents of the purge. Working alongside them and quickly overwhelming them in sheer numbers and ferocity was the broader Parisian mob. This was not simply the city's indigent population, but a wide array of ordinary people, boatmen, butchers, laborers, and even women and children caught up in the collective psychosis. This broad participation is critical to understanding the event. It was not an atrocity committed by a marginalized few, but an act of communal violence enacted by the city against a designated internal enemy. The primary modality of the violence was the domestic invasion. The massacre was not for the most part a series of street battles. It was a systematic violation of the home, the most fundamental unit of social order. Killing parties, often composed of neighbors, would force their way into the residencies of known or suspected Huguenots. The methods were intimate and low-tech, relying on the tools of everyday life and street combat: long knives from the butcher shop, spikes from the city arsenal, daggers, swords, and heavy clubs. Firearms were relatively rare among the populace, making the slaughter a close, physical, and profoundly brutal affair. Victims were killed in their beds, at their dinner tables, and while pleading for mercy on their knees. Entire family units were targeted for extermination, a method which served the dual purpose of eliminating the heresy and ensuring that no heirs were left to reclaim confiscated property. Symbolism was a pervasive and crucial element of the massacre. The simplest and most effective symbol was the white cross worn on the hats of the killers. This insignia functioned as a license, a visible declaration of allegiance to the Catholic cause that instantly distinguished perpetrator from potential victim. It created a powerful in-minus group dynamic and served to diffuse individual responsibility into the anonymous collective. The violence was also directed at property in a highly symbolic manner. Huguenot homes were not just looted, they were systematically gutted. Furniture was smashed, tapestries were torn, and commercial goods were destroyed. A particular focus was placed on the symbols of the Protestant faith. Huguenot Bibles and psalm books, the core of their religious identity, were torn apart, defiled, and burned in public bonfires, an act of symbolic intellectual annihilation. The most horrific rituals, however, were reserved for the bodies of the victims themselves. The post-mortem desecration of the corpses was a consistent and defining feature of the violence. Bodies were almost universally stripped of their clothing, a symbolic act that erased individual status and reduced the person to a naked object of scorn. They were then subjected to prolonged and imaginative mutilation, a practice for which the treatment of Caligula's body had provided a gruesome template. This was not random savagery, but a form of ritualized dehumanization, intended to punish the heretic even in death. Children were not spared. Accounts describe infants being snatched from their parents' arms and smashed against walls or thrown into the river. This specific targeting of the young was the ultimate expression of the massacre's purificatory logic, the complete eradication of the heretical bloodline, root and branch. The violence was performative, a public spectacle of cruelty designed to terrify, to cleanse, and to assert the absolute dominance of the Catholic faith upon the physical and social landscape of Paris. The systematic slaughter within the city's houses and courtyards created an immediate and unprecedented logistical challenge for the perpetrators and the municipal authorities, the disposal of the dead. Within the first 20-4 hours of the massacre, the narrow cobblestone streets of Paris were littered with thousands of corpses. They lay where they had fallen, thrown from windows or cut down as they fled, often stripped naked and bearing the marks of extreme mutilation. This proliferation of the dead posed a dual threat. It was a looming public health crisis in the stifling heat of late August, with the potential for disease to spread rapidly. It was also a visible testament to the scale of the violence or landscape of carnage, that if left unmanaged could threaten public order in a different way. The solution to this problem was as brutal in its simplicity as the massacre itself: the city's great artery, the River Seine. What followed was a second post-mortem phase of the purge, a vast and semi-organized effort to cleanse the streets by polluting the river. The civic militia and deputized groups of citizens were tasked with the collection of the bodies. Carts normally used for hauling refuse or goods were commandeered and trundled through the districts, their wooden beds soon piled high with the dead. These grim processions became a common sight, moving through the city towards the riverbanks. The process was crude and devoid of any ceremony. Corpses were dragged from houses by their limbs, roped together in groups and hauled through the mud and filth of the streets. The destination was any point of access to the river, the stone quays, the low banks, and most frequently the city's bridges. The Pont Neuf did not yet exist. The primary crossings were the Pont Notre Dame and the Ponto Change, both of which were lined with houses and shops, creating crowded canyon-like thoroughfares. From these bridges and from others like the Pont Saint-Michel, bodies were unceremoniously heaved over the parapets into the current below. The public nature of this disposal was a critical element of the event. Crowds gathered to watch, turning the act of desecration into a form of macabre public entertainment. The river, the source of the city's water, its main commercial highway and a central feature of its identity, was deliberately unsystematically transformed into a liquid grave. The environmental and psychological impact was immediate and profound. The sheer volume of bodies began to choke the river's flow. Contemporary accounts, though prone to exaggeration, speak of the water turning red in the shallows and of a pervasive stench of decomposition that hung over the city for weeks. The river's ecosystem was overwhelmed. Boatmen and fishermen whose livelihoods depended on the Seine found their work impossible. The bodies became navigational hazards, getting snagged on the piers of the bridges, clustering in eddies and washing up against the riverbanks and the floating mills that dotted the channel. The spectacle was unrelenting. For days the primary traffic on the Seine was not barges of wine or grain, but the pale bloated forms of the dead carried slowly by the current. This method of disposal served a crucial symbolic and theological purpose. To deny a person a Christian burial in the consecrated ground of a churchyard was the ultimate post-mortem punishment in 16th-century Europe. It was a statement that the deceased was outside the community of Christ, their soul, denied the proper rites of passage into the afterlife. Consigning a body to the river was to treat it as carrion or filth, denying the family any sight of mourning, and the community of mourning, and the community any act of closure. It was the final and most complete act of dehumanization, erasing the victim's identity and reducing them to mere refuse to be washed away. Furthermore, the river ensured that the evidence of the Parisian slaughter did not remain confined to the capital. The Seine flows northwest towards the English Channel, passing through major cities like Rouen. In the days and weeks that followed August 24th, the citizens of towns and villages downstream became unwilling witnesses to the events in Paris. The bodies that had been cast into the river began to wash ashore, often dozens at a time, bringing with them the undeniable physical proof of the massacre. The river became a gruesome conveyor, silently broadcasting the scale of the atrocity the French countryside. Thus the Seine became a vast flowing archive of the violence, a liquid grave that both hid the individual victims and broadcast the scale of the collective atrocity. In their violent effort to purify the spiritual landscape of the capital, the perpetrators had profoundly contaminated its physical hull. While the bodies of thousands of his followers were being consigned to the river and the streets of Paris were being systematically cleansed of his supporters, the fate of the Huguenots' highest-ranking leader Henry of Navarre was being decided not by a mob but by the cold calculus of dynastic politics. Henry, the bridegroom in a wedding that had become a city-wide funeral, was not a target for extermination, but an asset to be managed. Along with his cousin the young Prince of Conde, he represented the future of the Bourbon line and, by extension, a critical piece in the dynastic puzzle of France. Killing them would have been a step too far, an act that would have violated the sacred principle of royal blood and invited retribution from Protestant powers across Europe. Catherine de' Medici's plan for them was not annihilation but neutralization. In the early hours of the massacre, Henry and Conde were separated from their retinue, disarmed and brought under guard before a distraught and enraged King Charles IX. The scene, as reconstructed from contemporary accounts, was one of extreme psychological duress. The king, his hands metaphorically stained with the blood of Henry's friends and allies, presented his new brother minus law with an ultimatum of brutal simplicity: abjure the Protestant faith and convert to Catholicism or face immediate death. Some versions of the event had a third option, a lifetime of imprisonment in the Bastille, but the core choice was between spiritual capitulation and physical annihilation. Messe mort to Bastille mass death, or the Basteth, or the Basteth, or the Bastille became the legendary summary of the king's demand. For Henry this was a moment of acute and terrifying crisis. He was 20 years old, politically astute, but now completely isolated, a prisoner in his wife's family home, surrounded by the architects of the slaughter. The choice he faced was not merely personal, it was existential for the Huguenot cause. To choose death would be to become a martyr, a powerful symbol of faith and resistance, but a dead one. His martyrdom would inspire his followers, but it would remove from the board their most legitimate and powerful leader. The Bourbon claim to the French throne, which was becoming increasingly relevant, as the Valois sons failed to produce heirs, would be dangerously weakened. Martyrdom was an ideologically pure but strategically terminal option. The alternative conversion was an act of profound political pragmatism, but also one of deep personal and political betrayal. To accept the Mass would be to commit an act of apostasy in the eyes of his fellow Calvinists. He would be renouncing the faith for which thousands of his followers were at that very moment being killed. He would lose all credibility as a leader of the Protestant cause, becoming a trophy of the Catholic victory, a symbol of the ultimate failure of the Huguenot resistance. Yet it was the only path to survival. To live even as a Catholic prince, under house arrest, was to preserve the possibility of future action. It was a choice between a noble end and a deeply compromised but potentially more consequential future. Faced with this impossible decision, and with the sounds of the massacre likely audible even within the Louvre, both Henry and the Prince of Conde chose survival. Their conversion, however, could not be a simple private affair. For it to have the desired politically, a formal public act of submission. After days of intense theological instruction from court prelates, the princes were made to formally abjure their Calvinist faith. In a carefully staged ceremony, they attended Mass alongside the royal family, a public performance of their return to the Catholic fold. This act was a massive propaganda coup for the crown. It sent a message throughout France and Europe that the Huguenot cause was broken, its own leaders having abandoned the faith. Henry's conversion, however, did not grant him freedom. It merely changed the nature of his captivity. He was no longer a prisoner under sentence of death, but a royal hostage. He and his new wife Margaret were kept at court under constant watchful surveillance. He was forced to participate in Catholic rituals, to join the king on hunts and at council meetings, all while being treated with a mixture of familial affection and deep suspicion. He had traded his faith for his life and his freedom for the gilded cage of the Valois court. He was alive, but he was a pawn, a symbol of defeated heresy, waiting for the moment when the political landscape might shift once more in his favor. In the immediate aftermath of the unparalleled violence, the royal court faced a critical and urgent task: to construct an official narrative that would justify the massacre to its own populace and to the stunned, often horrified courts of Europe. The initial accounts given by the king and his council were contradictory and confused, betraying the panic and disarray within the Louvre. Within hours of the slaughter, however, a coherent, if entirely fabricated, story began to emerge, designed to deflect culpability from the crown and recast the bloodbath as an act of necessary statecraft. This official narrative, carefully crafted and aggressively disseminated, became the first and most enduring lens through which the street Bartholomew's Day massacre was understood for centuries. The central pillar of this revised narrative was the assertion of a vast Huguenot conspiracy. King Charles IX, who had only hours before given the bloody command, now declared that the massacre was a premonitory strike against a supposed Protestant plot to assassinate the royal family and seize control of the government. This was the same justification that Catherine de Medici and her inner circle had used to pressure the king into giving his consent on the night of August 23rd. Now it was presented as established fact. Official letters were dispatched to provincial governors throughout France, ordering them to replicate the Parisian purge and providing them with this ready-made explanation. The letters stated that Admiral Coligny and his followers had been discovered in a treacherous scheme, and that the king, in a moment of righteous self-defense, had ordered their swift execution. The mass killing of ordinary Huguenots was conveniently blamed on the spontaneous fury of the Parisian populace acting in loyalty to their king and their faith. To add credibility to this fabricated plot, a series of staged investigations were launched and tortured confessions from captured Huguenots were extracted, implicating Coligny and other prominent Protestants in elaborate schemes of regicide and rebellion. These confessions, obtained under duress and often under torture, provided the evidence required to officially condemn Coligny as a traitor even in death. His body, having been subjected to public degradation, was posthumously tried and condemned for treason, its severed head put on public display. This judicial farce was critical to legitimizing the violence in the eyes of the law and ensuring that the victims rather than the perpetrators were posthumously convicted of crimes against the state. The dissemination of this official narrative was a multi-pronged propaganda campaign. Within Paris, royal heralds proclaimed the king's version of events, while loyal Catholic preachers in pulpits across the city echoed the conspiracy theory, using it to further incite the populace and to sanctify the violence as God's will. Pamphlets and broadsides, carefully vetted by the royal censor, flooded the streets, depicting the Huguenots as treacherous rebels and the king as a heroic defender of the realm and the Catholic Church. The message was simple: the king had saved France from a Protestant coup. Internationally, the diplomatic challenge was immense. Protestant states like England and the German principalities reacted with outrage and horror, their ambassadors demanding explanations. Initially, the French court attempted to portray the massacre as an uncontrollable act of popular fury, a spontaneous uprising of loyal Catholics against Huguenot provocations, not as a planned royal operation. This version quickly proved untenable in the face of eyewitness accounts and the sheer scale of the organized violence. The court was forced to pivot, falling back on the Huguenot plot narrative, which offered a more coherent, albeit false, justification for royal involvement. Ambassadors were instructed to present this version to foreign courts, emphasizing the king's desperate need to defend himself against a clear and present danger. This official narrative, though widely disbelieved by Protestant powers and many Catholic intellectuals outside France, proved remarkably effective within the kingdom, particularly in cementing the loyalty of the Catholic population to the Valois monarchy. It provided a convenient rationale for the bloodbath, transforming an act of profound treachery and cruelty into a defensive measure for God and King. It was a testament to the power of state-sponsored disinformation and the willingness of a society gripped by fear and religious fervor to accept and collective violence. The truth of the street. Bartholomew's Day massacre was immediately buried under a carefully constructed edifice of lies, a foundation upon which the subsequent conflicts would be built. The massacre was never intended by its architects to remain a purely Parisian affair. The violence that erupted in the capital was merely the epicenter of a shockwave that was designed to travel throughout the kingdom. The same couriers who carried the official narrative of a Huguenot plot to the courts of Europe also carried secret, more direct instructions to the governors and loyal Catholic elites in the provinces. The message, whether explicitly written or implicitly understood, was that the king had sanctioned a decisive action against the Protestant leadership. This official directive, however, often moved slower than the news itself. Rumors, eyewitness accounts from those who managed to escape Paris in the initial chaos, and the chilling sight of bodies floating down the Loire and Seine rivers often preceded any royal command, creating an atmosphere of confusion, terror, and anticipatory violence. The result was not a single coordinated national purge, but a series of localized massacres, each shaped by local politics, personal animosities, and the specific zeal of regional leaders. The pattern of the provincial massacres often mirrored the Parisian template with horrifying fidelity. The violence typically began within days of the news arriving from the capital. In cities with strong Catholic League sympathies and a history of religious tension, the news acted as a spark on right tinder. On August 25th, the killing began in Meaux. On the 26th, it erupted in Orleans, where the population, already incensed by local Huguenots, engaged in a slaughter that lasted for days and claimed hundreds of lives. The Loire Valley region, with a significant Protestant population, became a string of killing fields, with massacres breaking out in Lot, Charette, Loire, Samar, and Angers. In each location, the process was grimly familiar. The local municipal authorities, often unprodded by a fanatical bishop or an ambitious governor, would mobilize the civic militia. Known Huguenots would be rounded up, sometimes under the pretext of being taken into protective custody in the local prisons. This protective custody was almost invariably a prelude to their murder. In Lyon, a major commercial hub with a large Protestant minority, the massacre began on August 31st. The Huguenots were systematically arrested and crowded into the city's prisons. A few days later, mobs led by the militia broke into the prisons and slaughtered the inmates. The city's executioner was reportedly employed to dispatch the prisoners with professional efficiency, a chilling example of the fusion of civic order and mob violence. The bodies, as in Paris, were then thrown into the Rhone. The violence continued to spread throughout September and into early October, a slow-burning fire consuming the Protestant communities of France. It reached Rouen in Normandy, where the killings were particularly brutal. In Bordeaux, the governor initially resisted the pressure, but eventually gave way, and the slaughter commenced in early October. Toulouse, a bastion of Catholic extremism in the south, witnessed a massacre of its imprisoned Huguenots that was among the most thorough and ruthless of all the provincial purges. The total number of victims in the provinces is impossible to calculate with certainty, but modern historical estimates consistently place the figure far higher than that of Paris, with a consensus range falling between 10,000 and 20,000 deaths, in addition to the estimated 3,000 killed in the capital. Crucially, however, the slaughter was not universal. The spread of the violence was complicated by a sudden and confusing reversal of royal policy. A few days after the initial event, as the scale of the Parisian bloodbath became clear and the international outcry began, the king issued a second set of orders on August 28. These new directives commanded the provincial governors to cease the killings and to restore order, reaffirming the principles of the Edict of Saint-Germain. This created a situation of profound ambiguity. Governors were now in possession of two contradictory commands from their sovereign. Their response became a matter of personal interpretation and moral choice. Some, like the governor of Burgundy, used the second order to halt the violence that had already begun. Others claimed the counter-minus order arrived late or chose to ignore it, continuing the purge under the authority of the initial command. In a few remarkable instances, governors and local officials actively refused to obey the initial implicit order for massacre. The Viscount d'Orthez, governor of Bayonne, famously replied to the court with the statement that he had found among the inhabitants many good citizens and brave soldiers, but not a single executioner. Similarly, the governors of Provence and other regions successfully protected the Huguenot populations under their jurisdiction, demonstrating that the violence was not an unstoppable tide, but a series of choices made by men in positions of power. These acts of defiance, however, were the exception. For weeks, France was a patchwork of terror, with the fate of its Protestant citizens resting entirely on the character and calculations of their local Catholic rulers. The news of the massacre, carried by frantic couriers, fleeing refugees and official diplomatic dispatches, spread across Europe and elicited a spectrum of reactions that perfectly mirrored the continent's deep religious and political divisions. The international response was not a monolithic condemnation, but a starkly polarized mixture of undisguised celebration and profound visceral horror. This divergence revealed the extent to which the schism of the Reformation had reconfigured the very foundations of European diplomacy and moral sentiment. In the capitals of Catholic Europe, the slaughter was largely interpreted through the lens of a holy war, a decisive and divinely sanctioned victory in the long struggle against heresy. In the Protestant world, it was seen as the ultimate act of perfidy, a confirmation of their worst fears about the treachery and inherent violence of the Roman Catholic Church and its secular allies. The most jubilant reaction came from the two great centers of Catholic power, Madrid and Rome. In Spain, King Philip I, the most powerful monarch in Europe and the self-styled champion of the counter-Reformation, reportedly laughed upon hearing the news, a rare display of emotion for the famously somber ruler. He viewed the massacre as a masterful stroke of policy by the French crown, a necessary and effective measure to crush a rebellion that had long destabilized a rival kingdom. For Philip, the elimination of Admiral Coligny was particularly welcome, as it permanently ended the threat of a French military intervention in the Netherlands on behalf of the Protestant Dutch rebels, a prospect that had been his primary strategic concern for years. He wrote to Catherine de' Medici congratulating her on her son's actions, calling it one of the greatest services ever rendered to Christendom. In Rome, the response was even more effusive and theological. When the news reached Pope Gregory XI, he ordered the immediate celebration of a Te Deum, a solemn hymn of thanksgiving, in the Basilica of St. Peter. The city of Rome was illuminated with celebratory bonfires for 3 nights. The Pope commanded a special commemorative medal to be struck, one side bearing his own image, the other depicting an angel with a sword and a cross standing over the slaughtered bodies of the Huguenots. The inscription on the medal read Ugio Notto Notto IO MSDRAGS 1570 to the slaughter of the Huguenots 1000. 572. Furthermore, he commissioned the artist Giorgio Vasari to paint a series of frescoes in the Sola Regia of the Vatican Palace, the main reception hall, depicting the key events of the massacre, including the killing of Coligny. For the papacy, the street Bartholomew's Day massacre was not a tragedy to be lamented, but a triumph to be immortalized in art and metal, a righteous judgment of God upon the heretics. The reaction in the Protestant states was one of uniform shock and revulsion. In Geneva, the spiritual heart of Calvinism, the news was met with public fasting and prayer. The city, which had been a refuge for French Protestants for decades, was plunged into mourning. In the Protestant principalities of the Holy Roman Empire, the massacre was seen as a terrifying precedent, raising fears that a similar solution could be applied to them. In England, the court of Queen Elizabeth I was thrown into a state of official mourning. The English ambassador in Paris, Sir Francis Walsingham, had witnessed the events firsthand, sheltering terrified refugees in his own embassy. When the French ambassador attempted to deliver his king's official explanation for the events at the English court, he was received by a silent black-clad assembly of courtiers who listened to his justifications in stony accusatory silence. Elizabeth herself, a master of pragmatic diplomacy, was personally horrified, but her political response was measured, constrained by the need to maintain a fragile alliance with France against the greater threat of Spain. The massacre had a profound and lasting impact on Protestant political thought. It shattered any remaining trust in the oaths and treaties of Catholic monarchs. The event became a cornerstone of Protestant martyrology, immortalized in countless pamphlets, woodcuts and histories that circulated across Europe. John Knox, the fiery leader of the Scottish Reformation, called for a pan-Protestant league to avenge the slaughter. Bartholomew's became a byword for the ultimate Catholic treachery, a cautionary tale of what happened when one trusted the word of a papist prince. It fueled a deep-seated paranoia and hardened the lines of confessional conflict, ensuring that the wars of religion would continue with an even greater degree of bitterness and mutual distrust. The massacre, intended to solve a French domestic problem, had instead sent a tremor through the entire geopolitical and religious landscape of Europe. The primary strategic objective of the street Bartholomew's Day massacre, from the perspective of Catherine de' Medici and her council, was brutally simple: to decapitate the Huguenot movement and thereby end the cycle of civil wars that had plagued France for a decade. By eliminating the entire tier of experienced military and political leadership in a single decisive blow, they believed the Protestant cause would be left rudderless and broken, its capacity to wage war permanently crippled. The forced conversion of the Bourbon princes Henry of Navarre and the Prince of Conde was intended to complete this political neutering, removing the Huguenots' most potent symbols of legitimate resistance. In the cold analytical light of history, this strategic calculation proved to be one of the most catastrophic misjudgments in the history of the French monarchy. The massacre did not end the French wars of religion; instead it guaranteed their continuation with a renewed and unprecedented ferocity. The immediate effect of the slaughter was not the pacification of the Huguenot populace, but its radicalization. The events in Paris and the provinces shattered the influence of the moderate Protestant faction, the so-called politiques, who had advocated for a negotiated settlement with the crown and believed in the possibility of a religiously pluralistic state. After Street, the massacre was seen as the ultimate proof that the Valois monarchy could not be trusted, that its promises of tolerance were merely traps, and that coexistence with the Catholic majority was impossible. The new Huguenot leadership that emerged from the ashes was drawn from a harder, more uncompromising stock of southern French nobles and radical Calvinist theologians. They no longer sought accommodation within the French state; they sought to create a state within a state, a self-governing Protestant republic in the south of France. This ideological shift was almost immediately translated into military action. The Huguenot strongholds of the south and west of France, cities like La Rochelle, Daubigny and Nimes, did not surrender in the face of the terror. Instead, they closed their gates, raised their militias, and prepared for a war of survival. The most dramatic example of this renewed resistance was the siege of La Rochelle, a heavily fortified Huguenot port city on the Atlantic coast. When the royal army, commanded by the Duke of Anjou, the king's brother and one of the massacre's chief architects, arrived to demand its submission in late 1570 to the city, refused. The subsequent siege lasted for more than 6 months, becoming a heroic symbol of Protestant defiance. Despite a massive royal army and a naval blockade, the citizens of La Rochelle starving, but resolute held out against all odds. Their epic resistance demonstrated to all of France that the Huguenot military spirit was not broken but had been forged into something harder and more resilient. The failure of the siege of La Rochelle in mid-1573 was a public humiliation for the crown and forced Charles IX to the negotiating table. The resulting Edict of Bartholomew, which officially ended the Fourth War of Religion, was a testament to the failure of the Massacre's strategic goals. While the edict was far more restrictive than the previous peace of Saint-Germain, it still granted the Huguenots freedom of conscience and limited rights of worship in their key stronghold. The very fact that the crown was forced to sign yet another peace treaty with the faction it had attempted to annihilate only a year earlier was a stark admission of its policy's complete and utter failure. Furthermore, the massacre had a profoundly destabilizing effect on the Catholic political landscape as well. It created a new political category, the moderate Catholic malcontents. This group, composed of aristocrats like the king's own youngest brother Franz, or Duke of Alençon, and the powerful Montmorency family cousins, to the murdered Admiral Coligny, were appalled by the bloodshed and fearful of the growing power of the ultra-Catholic Guise faction and the influence of Spain. They began to form alliances of convenience with the Huguenot rebels, creating a powerful cross-confessional opposition to the royal government. The crown, having tried to eliminate one enemy, now found itself facing to its authority more fragile than ever. The massacre, intended as a final solution, had instead become the primary catalyst for a more complex and intractable phase of the civil wars, ensuring that France would know no lasting peace for another generation. Beyond the immediate political consequences, the street Bartholomew's Day massacre inflicted a deep and lasting psychic wound upon the collective consciousness of France. The event's true legacy was not measured in the thousands of dead, the reignition of war, or the redrawing of factional lines, but in the systematic and permanent destruction of social trust. The violence of August 1572 was not primarily that of an army against an enemy. It was the violence of neighbors of a king against his sworn subjects, of a city against a part of itself. This profound betrayal of the most fundamental social contracts left behind a legacy of paranoia and trauma that would poison French society for generations, fundamentally altering the relationship between the people, the state, and the very concept of a shared national identity. For the Huguenot community, the trauma was absolute and existential. The survivors were a people twice victimized, first by the physical violence and second by the psychological terror of having their world inverted. The home, the ultimate sanctuary, had become a death trap. The law embodied by the king and his magistrates had become the instrument of their murder. A royal wedding, the symbol of union, had been the bait for their extermination. This inversion of all social norms created a pervasive and enduring paranoia. No Catholic neighbor could be fully trusted again. No royal edict of tolerance could be read without suspicion of a hidden blade. The state-seated distrust became a defining characteristic of Huguenot identity, forcing them into a state of permanent defensive vigilance. They became in essence internal exiles within their own nation. This trauma was codified and memorialized in a vast and potent body of Protestant literature and art. The years following 1570 saw a flood of pamphlets, polemics, and engravings that sought to document and interpret the slaughter. Works like the Reveille minus Mat in Desfrans spawned the graphic, detailed prints of artists such as Torrent and Paris, sin ensured that the memory of the massacre would not fade. These were not objective histories, they were instruments of a collective trauma response, a form of martyrology that enshrined the victims and demonized their killers. The massacre became the foundational myth of the Huguenot struggle, a sacred event that proved their persecution and justified their continued resistance. By meticulously recording the names of the dead and the manner of their deaths, they transformed a chaotic slaughter into an ordered narrative of faith and sacrifice, giving meaning to an otherwise unbearable event. This psychological wound also gave rise to a radical new wave of Protestant political theory. Before the massacre, most Huguenot thinkers had adhered to the traditional Calvinist doctrine of obedience to the magistrate, even a tyrannical one. Street Bartholomew's Day shattered this doctrine. In its wake, a group of writers known as the Monarchoma CHS fighters against monarchs developed a sophisticated and revolutionary theory of legitimate resistance. Thinkers like François Hotman and his Franco Gallia, the anonymous author of the highly influential V Indicia e Contra Tyrann NOS, argued that a king who murders his own subjects breaks the sacred covenant between ruler and ruled. In doing so, he ceases to be a legitimate king and becomes a tyrant. A tyrant, they argued, could be lawfully resisted and, in the most extreme interpretations, even deposed or killed. This was a seismic shift in European political thought, providing a powerful theological and legal justification for rebellion. The King of France, by his actions, had inadvertently delegitimized the very basis of his own absolute authority. On the Catholic side, the psychological legacy was more complex, a mixture of tridemohyssum's deep-seated anxiety and, for some, a dawning sense of horror. For the fanatical Parisian, mobbing the ultra-Catholic leadership, the Massacre was a source of righteous pride, a divine cleansing that had purified their city. This belief hardened their ideological resolve and made any future compromise with the heretics unthinkable. For many ordinary Catholics, however, the sheer unrestrained brutality of the event, particularly the killing of women and children, left a residue of unease. Yet to admit the act was a monstrous crime was to admit collective guilt on a scale that was psychologically untenable. The easier path was to embrace the official narrative of a Huguenot plot, a justification that, while false, provided a necessary moral shield. This reinforced a paranoid worldview in which the Huguenots were a perpetually demonic and treacherous fifth column, justifying past violence and making future atrocities more likely. The legacy of the massacre was therefore a nation of irreconcilable memories to incompatible truth, slopped in a struggle for the soul of the kingdom. While the French kingdom reeled from its self-inflicted wound, the author of the violence, King Charles IX, began a precipitous and horrifying decline. The massacre, which he had been goaded into authorizing, appeared to unleash a torrent of psychological and physical ailments that would consume him within 2 years. His fate became a gruesome postscript to the event, a case study in how an act of state-sanctioned violence can destroy not only its victims, but also its perpetrator. In the immediate aftermath, Charles attempted to project an image of decisive authority. He formally claimed responsibility for the purge at a special session of the Paris Parliament on August 26, framing it as a necessary action to save the state. But this public performance of royal resolve was a thin mask over a disintegrating psyche. Contemporaries at court noted a dramatic change in his demeanor. The already nervous and volatile king became increasingly erratic, subject to fits of violent rage alternating with periods of deep melancholic depression. He was haunted by his decision. The most potent and enduring account of his torment, though likely embellished by Huguenot propagandists, claims that he was plagued by auditory hallucinations. He would reportedly leap from his bed at night, convinced he could hear the screams and groans of the dying, a phantom echo of the slaughter that his own guards had carried out under his windows. His primary physician, Bartholomew, a Huguenot whom the king had personally sheltered and saved during the massacre, documented his patient's profound distress, noting his feverish, broken sleep and his constant agitated state. The violence he had unleashed upon his kingdom had turned inward, becoming a relentless siege upon his own mind. This severe mental decline was soon accompanied by a catastrophic physical collapse. In the months following the massacre, as the royal army was failing in its costly and humiliating siege of La Rochelle, the king's health began to visibly fail. He was afflicted by a persistent high fever and was frequently drenched in debilitating sweats. His breathing became labored and he developed a racking cough that produced blood. The most dramatic and terrifying symptom recorded by multiple chroniclers was a form of hematidrose, is a rare medical condition where extreme stress causes capillary blood vessels, feeding the sweat glands, to rupture. As a result, the king would literally sweat blood, his skin becoming covered in a reddish viscous fluid that seeped through his bedclothes. This symptom, with its horrifying biblical overtones, was seen by many as a physical manifestation of his guilt, his body weeping the blood he had caused to be shed. The official diagnosis for the king's condition was tuberculosis, a common and often fatal disease of the era. The relentless course of his illness, the wasting, the fever, the pulmonary hemorrhages, is certainly consistent with an aggressive form of the disease. Yet it is impossible to separate his physical deterioration from the profound psychological shock of August 1572. Modern medical understanding would suggest that the extreme and sustained stress he experienced likely compromised his immune system, allowing a latent tuberculous infection to erupt with lethal force. His body in effect surrendered. His final months were a period of political paralysis and physical agony. He was too weak to govern effectively, leaving the affairs of a still warring state in the hands of his mother. on May 30, 1570, for less than 2 years after the massacre, the 23-year, old king lay dying in the chateau, even Seine. His deathbed was a scene of reported contrition and despair. He is said to have turned to his old nurse, a woman he trusted, and confessed, "Oh, my nurse, my dear, what bloodshed and what murders I have seen, what evil counsel I have followed. Oh, what have I done? I am lost, I know it well." In his final lucid moments he expressed deep concern for his wife and infant daughter and, in a surprising turn, appointed his old adversary and brother Law Henry of Navarre as regent to protect them, a final futile gesture of reconciliation. Charles IX died in a state of physical and spiritual torment, his reign forever defined, not by any political achievement but by the spectre of a massacre that had consumed his kingdom, his reputation, and ultimately his own life. With the death of Charles IX, the formal authority of the massacre's sovereign author was extinguished, but its chief political architect and the enduring power behind the throne, Catherine de' Medici, remained. The king who had given the fatal command was gone, but the queen mother who had guided his hand to it now faced the consequences, securing the regency, until her favoured son Henry, Duke of Anjou, could return from his brief and happy reign as King of Poland to be crowned Henry III of France. For Catherine, the massacre was a political act, a terrible necessity in her view, but for history, it would become the single defining event of her long and complex career. Assessing her role and motivations has become one of the great contentious debates in the study of the French Renaissance, a process that reveals as much about the biases of later ages as it does about the woman herself. The first and most enduring historical verdict cast Catherine as a malevolent Machiavellian queen, the sole premeditating author of the entire tragedy. This interpretation, which became known as the Black Legend, was born almost immediately from the pens of Huguenot survivors and Protestant polemicists across Europe. In this narrative, Catherine is a monstrous figure, an Italian serpent who imported the amoral, poisonous politics of her Florentine homeland into the French court. The wedding of her daughter to Henry of Navarre was not, in this view, a genuine attempt at peace, but a cynical and elaborate trap planned months, or even years in advance. Every feast was a deception, every royal promise a lie. Her motives were seen as a compound of an unquenchable thirst for power and a fanatical counter-Reformation zeal to exterminate Protestantism from France. This portrayal, amplified by influential works of the time, fixed her in the popular imagination as a she-devil, a cold, calculating puppet-master, who manipulated her weak-willed sons and orchestrated the slaughter with inhuman cruelty. For centuries this was the dominant interpretation. It was a compelling narrative of good versus evil, of Protestant martyrs versus a tyrannical Catholic queen. However, beginning in the 20th century, a significant revisionist school of historical thought emerged, seeking to understand Catherine's actions not through the lens of religious melodrama, but through the cold, pragmatic context of 16th-century statecraft. These historians argue that Catherine's primary lifelong objective was not the eradication of her faith but the preservation of the Valois dynasty and the territorial integrity of France. Her policy of balancing the Huguenot and Guise factions, they contend, was a genuine if perilous strategy to prevent the kingdom from being torn apart by aristocratic ambition. In this revisionist view, the massacre was not a long-minded premeditated plot, but a desperate, panicked improvisation born in the 48 hours following the failed assassination of Admiral Coligny. Catherine, seeing the Huguenots armed and demanding justice that would implicate her allies and fearing a pre-assumptive Huguenot coup or a new civil war, made a ruthless political calculation. The targeted elimination of the Huguenot leadership was seen as the lesser of two evils, a swift surgical strike to prevent a wider conflict that would surely destroy the monarchy. It was in this interpretation an act not of fanatical hatred, but of extreme paranoid political survival, a catastrophic miscalculation that spiraled out of her control when it merged with the popular fury of Paris. The plan was for a limited purge, not a general pogrom. The truth of Catherine de' Medici's role likely lies in the grey, uncomfortable space between these two poles. To absolve her of responsibility is impossible. She was the central figure in the secret council that made the decision. Her influence was the decisive factor in breaking her son's will. Her comfort with political assassination and duplicity is well documented. However, to cast her as the sole author of the event is to oversimplify a complex causal chain. She did not create the deep religious hatred of the Parisian populace, nor did she personally wield the blade of the Duke of Guise's vendetta. She was a master of political maneuvering who, faced with a crisis that threatened to overwhelm her, chose a solution whose sheer brutality she likely underestimated and whose consequences she could not control. Her legacy is therefore one of tragic and profound failure. The act she authorized to save the Valois dynasty and secure a lasting peace for her sons ultimately delegitimized the monarchy, intensified the civil wars, and ensured that she would be remembered not as the pragmatic savior of the French state, but as the bloody queen of street, Bartholomew's Day. Amid the ruins of the Valois dynasty and the wreckage of Catherine de' Medici's grand strategy, one figure remained: Henry of Navarre. The ultimate survivor of the massacre, he was the living embodiment of the policy's failure. For nearly 4 years following the events of August 1572, he remained a prisoner at the French court, a hostage in a gilded cage. His conversion to Catholicism was the price of his life, and his daily existence was a masterclass in political survival. He cultivated a persona of a frivolous debt-ridden courtier more interested in romantic dalliances and games of chance. This mask of harmlessness, however, belied a keen political intelligence being sharpened by constant observation. He watched the Valois court decay from within, studied the shifting alliances, and learned the brutal mechanics of power from the very people who had murdered his friends. He was playing a long game, waiting for his moment. That moment arrived in early 1576, with the kingdom once again descending into civil war, this time complicated by the malcontent alliance of moderate Catholics and Huguenots. Henry saw his opportunity. During a hunting expedition, he slipped away from his royal minders and made a daring escape from court, riding hard for the Protestant miners-controlled territories in the south. His first act upon regaining his freedom was a powerful and symbolic one. He publicly abjured the Catholic faith that had been forced upon him at sword minus point and formally rejoined the Protestant Church. This act of Ray Minus conversion instantly Ray Minus established his credibility, and Ray Minus asserted his position as the undisputed leader of the Huguenot cause. The hostage had become a general once more. The ensuing years saw the French wars of religion devolve into their most chaotic and destructive phase, the so-called War of the Three Henrys. It was a complex three-way struggle for the soul of France. In one corner was Henry of Navarre, leading the Huguenot forces with charisma and considerable military skill. In another was the reigning King Henry, the last of the Valois sons, struggling to maintain the authority of a weakened and bankrupt monarchy. In the third corner was the formidable Henry, Duke of Guise, now the leader of the ultra-Catholic League, a popular movement backed by Spanish gold that had become so powerful it directly threatened to usurp the throne itself. The brutal logic of the street. Bartholomew's Day massacre finally came full circle to consume its own architects. In 1588, driven to desperation by the Guises' dominance over Paris, King Henry lured his powerful rival to the Château de Bourbon, had him assassinated by his personal bodyguards, a mirror image of the killing of Coligny 16 years earlier. This act, intended to restore royal authority, instead backfired, causing the Catholic League to erupt in open rebellion against the regicide king. Left with no other allies, King Henry was forced into an unlikely alliance with the very man his family had tried to kill, the Protestant Henry of Navarre, but this alliance was short-lived. In August 1589, King Henry was himself assassinated by a fanatical Catholic monk seeking to avenge the Duke of Guise. With his dying breath, the last Valois king made a declaration that would seal the fate of France. He formally recognized Henry of Navarre as his legitimate heir. The ultimate tyranny was now complete. The man who had come to Paris for a wedding and narrowly escaped a massacre was now, by the laws of succession, King Henry IV of France. Yet his claim was bitterly contested. Catholic France, particularly Paris, refused to accept a heretic king. For more years he fought to win his own kingdom. Finally, in an act of supreme political pragmatism, Henry made his final, most famous strategic choice. Concluding that the country would never know peace under a Protestant ruler, he is famously said to have declared that Paris is worth a mass. In 1593, he converted to Catholicism for a second and final time. This time, however, it was not the capitulation of a hostage, but the strategic decision of a statesman. This final conversion broke the back of the Catholic League's resistance. Paris opened its gates and he was finally crowned in his own capital. His life's work culminated in the Edict of Nantes in 1598. This landmark decree issued by the survivor of St. Bartholomew's Day granted French Protestants substantial rights and freedoms, officially ending the wars of religion. The policy of extermination had failed, and the peace it was meant to achieve was ultimately delivered by the very man it had been designed to destroy. The narrative of the massacre and its long bloody aftermath ultimately resolves into a profound and unsettling study of ideology and power. It is a story that begins with an act of extreme religious and political certainty, that the complex wounds of a kingdom could be cauterized by a single decisive act of violence. The conspirators in the Louvre operated under the conviction that by eliminating a few dozen men they could eliminate an idea and secure a dynasty. But the torrent of popular hatred they unleashed washed away not only their victims but the very foundations of the state they sought to protect. The Valois monarchy, which had sanctioned the killing to preserve its own authority, was ultimately consumed by the very cycle of assassination and paranoia it had set in motion. In the end, the solution to this decades-long conflict born of ideological fanaticism was found not in greater doctrinal purity, but in its opposite of profound and weary pragmatism. Henry IV, the ultimate survivor, was a man who learned the hard lesson that a kingdom cannot be governed by the sword of theological absolutism. His famous conversions, decried by zealots on both sides as acts of cynical apostasy, were in fact acts of state-building. He chose political unity over personal piety, recognizing that the survival of the nation was a more pressing concern than the salvation of his own soul in the eyes of his former followers. The Edict of Nantes was not a declaration of religious truth. It was an admission of political reality. It was a document that enshrined not a shared faith but a shared exhausted desire for peace. The story, therefore, does not conclude with a victory for either Catholicism or Protestantism, but with a victory for the nascent idea of a secular state that could exist above and apart from the absolute claims of religious belief. It is a testament paid for in blood to the hard-1 discovery that tolerance is not a theological virtue but a political necessity. And so that chapter of human darkness closed. But history has a habit of rhyming. Watch for the patterns in your own time. The account is now finished.